In today's video, I'll be ranking every card, tower troop, and evolution in Clash Royale after the recent balance changes and now that we have the Evolve Hunter in the game for the month of March. As always, S tier is the highest rank a card can receive. It means it's very versatile and there's a good chance it needs a nerf. A tier means the card is well above average. B tier is the upper end of average. C tier is the lower end of average. D tier means the card is below average, and F tier means the card is well below average, not versatile, and there's a high chance it could use a buff. Starting off with these skeletons, and keep in mind, guys, I'm ranking the regular cards, all the evolutions I'm doing at the end. The regular skeletons are going in S tier. Recently, a lot of people have gone back to the regular version because the evolved skeletons were nerfed from 4 to 3. People have decided to run the regular skeletons in their deck instead and use their evolution slots on other things. This is why the regular skeletons are so commonly seen inside of cycle decks, whether it's Hog Cycle, Royal Hog Cycle, Expo, and even heavier things like the Royal Giant. The skeletons work so well in. They're just such a versatile, cheap card to allow you to cycle really quick. The Bomber is going to be going in A tier. It's a 2 elixir splash card. It's quite versatile as well. You can use it inside of heavier things like with the Lava Hound, for example, the Golem, but it also can be used inside of cheaper things like with the Goblin Drill, for example. The Goblins are going to be going in A tier, even though there's 4 of them and they deal a lot of DPS for only 2 elixir. Things like the Skeletons, the Guards, and the Goblin Gang are just going to simply be better options in the majority of decks, and they just tend to get more value. The Spear Goblins are going to be going in B tier. Recently, they haven't been as good, but they're still viable in a few different types of things, like Mega Knight Bait, for example, mortar decks, but after the small nerf they got, they haven't been as prevalent. The regular Zap is going to be going in D tier. Almost everyone running the Zap is running the Evolve version, which just gets significantly more value. An Evolve Zap is able to kill things like a Firecracker, for example, and it gets 2 resets, as opposed to the regular Zap that only gets 1, which is why you might only rarely see it inside of Lava Hound here and there, but pretty much everyone has the Evolve version. That's the thing that gets a lot of value. The regular Knight is going to be going in A tier. He has good stats for his cost. That's what the saying is, and it's very true. He has a lot of health for his elixir cost. Very versatile inside of cycle decks, like with the Hog Rider, for example, maybe a Mortar. And then he's also going to be very viable inside of heavier things as well. Graveyard decks, for example, he's going to be a fantastic choice. The Archers are going to be going in D tier. Even after the arrows nerf, the arrows are still so prevalent, which of course is a great counter to the Archers, and that's pretty much why the regular Archers, you're really only seeing them inside of Expo, and that's about it, and majority of people are running the Evolve version. The Minions are going to be going inside of C tier. Kind of the same thing as the Archers. Arrows are just used so much, but they're a bit more viable than the Archers because, of course, you see them inside of things like Giant Graveyard, and maybe Lava Hound from time to time, but there's going to be way better flying card options than the Minions, which I will get to. And believe it or not, guys, the arrows are going in A tier. This might be surprising because they have been in S tier for the longest time, but after that radius nerf they got in the last set of balance changes, it has definitely toned down the usage of the arrows a bit, and you're actually seeing some heavier spells like the Fireball and the Lightning, even though they cost more elixir use just as much. But with that being said, the arrows are still going to be a fantastic choice inside of things like Lava Hound, maybe even Mortar Bait, Giant Graveyard, and they're very good as a spell, but I just no longer think they are S tier, which might be surprising to a lot of people. The Cannon is actually going in B tier. This dropped a bit as well after the nerf the Cannon ended up getting to its fire rate. It's definitely been being played less and less, and the majority of people now are running the Evolve Cannon, which means the regular one, I just don't think it's as good, and it's no longer an A tier building in my opinion. I have it at B tier. The Tesla, though, is going in C tier. Definitely worse than the Cannon. The Evolved Tesla, too, with how bad that is, that means a lot of people aren't even going to be running the regular Tesla. It's pretty much only viable in Expo, and that's about it. And that's the main problem with the Tesla. It just doesn't get nearly as much value as it used to before after the nerfs it ended up getting. The Mortar is also going to be going in C tier because we're in a beatdown meta currently with so many people running things like the Giant, for example, or even the Goblinstein. Even after all the nerfs it ended up getting, still very prevalent, just a ton of tanks in general Golem's even making a comeback. There's Goblin Giant, you name it. Mortar has just been significantly worse, and it just hasn't been as good as it used to be. The Barbarians are going to be going in D tier. With all the Fireball in the meta, they are just not great. You pretty much can only run them inside of Lava Hound, and that's about it. And even inside of Lava Hound, they're not even a requirement, because you can run things like the Guards, you can run the Valkyrie, you just have a lot of defensive options that you can use instead of the Barbarians, which just simply don't get very much value. And it's kind of the same case as the Minion Horde. It's just too vulnerable to spells. There's still a lot of people running things like arrows, and even things like Fireball, Poison, just getting a lot of value against them, the Royal Delivery, so it's kind of hard to have them synergize well in decks, which is just why they're not that great. The Tombstone is going to be going in C tier. I feel like it's just gotten worse and worse as the meta has changed, just as we've gotten new cards added a while ago. Of course, things like the Earthquake, and then of course the Poison, very good against it, and you have the Evolved Goblin Cage that can be used instead of the Tombstone inside of things like Lava Hound. It's just not as good of a card to use anymore, and even inside of Graveyard, you see it less and less. It's no longer a requirement, and it's kind of based on just opinion and personal preference if you want to use or not. The Musketeer is going to be going in B tier. She's definitely a little bit better inside of things like Hog, as well as Loon Cycle, after she got that first attack buff, but she's by no means OP or anything like that. She's just a little bit better, a nice bump from, I believe I always used to put her in around D tier, and I would consider her around B tier now. And of course, a lot of people running her, though, are mostly playing her because of the Evolved Musketeer, but I think the standard version, definitely a lot better. The Valkyrie's going to be going in C tier. The main reason for this is because a lot of people, unless you're on mid-ladder, don't run the regular Valkyrie. The main reason why people use her is to get to that evolved version, of course. The regular Knight, just going to be a much better option than the regular Valkyrie in a lot of scenarios, because he costs one less elixir, and oftentimes you're not going to need that splash value. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to use her compared to the Knight in a lot of scenarios. The Hog Rider, of course, going to be going in A tier. He's always a very, very consistent win condition. He never seems to fall off no matter what the meta is. It doesn't matter how many people are running the Tornado, the Fisherman. People always find a way to make him work, especially because there's a lot of different Hog decks you can use. Of course, there's Old Fashioned 2.6. There's Hog EQ, there's Hog X NATO. You can always find a way to make him work. And of course, Hog Firecracker, everyone's personal favorite, or most hated, you could say. The Mini P.E.K.K.A. is going to be going in B tier. I feel like it's a little better ever since I got that buff where it's dealing a bit more damage. Definitely not broken or anything, but way better inside of things like Giant, as well as Goblin Giant. Definitely a pretty solid support card at the moment. And guys, the Fireball is going to be going in S tier. It is a very, very solid medium spell at the moment. I consider it a lot better than the Poison, as well as the Earthquake, and in a lot of decks, it's actually replaced the arrows. A lot of Lava players now are running the Fireball over the arrows, because now that the arrows have a smaller radius, there's less of a reason to use it compared to the Fireball that deals significantly more damage for only one more elixir. Of course, you're commonly seeing it as well inside of decks where you want direct damage immediately. So that would be with the Royal Giant, that would be with the Expo, the Hog Rider, things along those lines. So it's a very versatile spell. You can kind of see it across the board inside of cheap decks and also heavier decks, which is why I definitely think it is S tier at the moment. The Bomb Tower is going to be going in B tier. I kind of consider it on par with the Cannon currently, because you can use it in a couple different things. You can use it inside of minor wall breakers if you want to, Loon Cycle, but it's not too versatile outside of that. I feel like right now buildings are kind of balanced in a way. There aren't too many buildings that are too broken, and a lot are kind of average, like the Cannon and the Bomb Tower. They're sort of perfect examples of that, so I think the Bomb Tower is exactly where it needs to be. The Giant is in a great spot in this current meta. There's so many people running things like Giant Graveyard, and also Giant Prince, Giant Evo Lumberjack. Just in general, the Giant is outstanding because there's more people running the Dagger Duchess. The Dagger Duchess is the second best tower troop in the game currently, and the Giant is a good tank, and she ends up using all her daggers on top of the Giant, so then whatever you have behind the Giant ends up getting a lot of value. That's why the Giant is really strong, and it's debatably one of the best win conditions in the game, which is definitely why he is in A tier. The Wizard is going in F tier. just very vulnerable to spells like the Fireball, the Poison, the Lightning. He just doesn't have good synergy in a lot of different decks. That's another issue for him as well. And unless you're on mid ladder, he's just really not that great. The Inferno Tower is going to be going in B tier 2. The Inferno Tower is in a decent spot. It's kind of one that always tends to fluctuate depending on the meta. Logbait is in a decent spot at the moment, especially with the Evolved Goblin Barrel. The Inferno pairs very well with that. Very situational, though, because it's going to be practically useless against cycle decks, but it's going to be amazing against beatdown decks, like against the Giant, the Lava Hound. So it really depends on what you're playing against, which is why it's kind of an average card. The Goblin Hut is going to be going in F tier. So bad against tons of spells, whether it's the Poison or the Earthquake. And then not even just that. I mean, what deck are you going to fit it in? It's just, you can't really make it work in anything. It's just, you know, kind of a dead card. So not really much more to say than that. The Rocket is going to be going in B tier. Again, kind of like the Inferno, going to be absolutely incredible inside of things like Logbait. It's kind of matchup dependent. Of course, in Triple Elixir, no matter what the matchup is, it's nice to get that Rocket cycle going. It's, of course, going to be pretty good inside of Expo if you want as well, Icepo specifically, and maybe you can make it work in Goblin Drill, but of course, Logbait is going to be the primary deck that you expect to see the Rocket in. The Elixir Collector's actually going in D tier. I think one of the biggest reasons why it's not F tier at the moment is because Golem has made a tiny bit of a comeback. Also, there's a tiny bit of Three Musketeers, which of course you see the pump in, and because it's not completely dead, that's the reason why I don't have it in F tier. You could also make it work with the Elixir Golem if you want as well, and I think part of it is because the Dagger Duchess pairs well with it, so the Dagger Duchess has helped revive it a tiny bit, but it certainly has not revived the Barbarian Hut, which is going in F tier. The Barb Hut, just like the Gob Hut, so bad. It just gets absolutely no value. It's just horrible. I would not recommend using it. I mean, maybe you can make it work in Retro Royale, but that's about it. The Mirror's also going in F tier. Not really any deck that you would want to run it in. I mean, you got to pay more to play the same thing, which of course is just simply not going to be valuable. You pretty much almost never want to do that. It makes your cycle very awkward. The Rage Spell is going to be going in A tier. I feel like there's so many different things the Rage Spell synergizes well with, especially things that are very quick and annoying. So it'd be things like the Mini P.E.K.K.A, the Goblin Giant, the Prince. I mean, the Evo Lumberjack also kind of goes well with the Rage as well. The Ram Rider, you can kind of make it work in a lot of different things. It's actually the type of card that fits well in a lot of different off-meta decks, but also meta decks at the same time. So it's just a very well-rounded card. The Skeleton Army, I'm going to put it in F tier. Might be kind of debatable. Maybe some people would argue it's not that bad, but it doesn't really fit well in anything. There's no deck you're required to use it in. If you're running it, you're kind of choosing to make your deck more off-meta because of it, and it's just so weak to pretty much every spell in the game. The Goblin Barrel is going to be going in C tier. This might be surprising to you guys with how good Logbait is, but a big part of the reason why Logbait is so good is because of the Evolved Goblin Barrel. Think of it, the regular Goblin Barrel is way worse. Pretty much everyone running the Goblin Barrel has the Evolved version, so they're eventually trying to get to that, but they have to play the regular one in the process. So the standard one, I really just don't think it's all that. That's my reasoning for putting it only in C tier, especially with how prevalent things like the Dagger Duchess is, as well as the Log, Barb Barrel, and a bunch of other spells. The Baby Dragon is going to be going in B tier. Ever since it got that buff where the splash radius was increased, we've definitely seen a return of the Baby Dragon, especially inside of things like Lumberloon Freeze, Golem, Graveyard, pretty much any deck where you can expect to be able to fit a Baby Dragon in. It's just more likely to use it now over other things like maybe the Mega Minion or the Electro Dragon, so its usage rate has definitely been increased and it's made a return and no longer a below average card anymore. The Freeze is going to be going in D tier. It's kind of a niche card. I mean, you might see it here and there inside of Graveyard Freeze or Lumberloon Freeze, but I mean, beyond that, it's not really that viable and it's never too OP in the meta. The Witch, guys, believe it or not, I guess the small buff did help her out a little bit because I've been seeing her a tiny bit again inside of things like Giant Graveyard. So I don't think she's completely dead. The reason I'm not putting her in D tier is because I definitely would say the Wizard is worse than her. So that's kind of why she's in D tier and not F tier, because I do objectively think she's going to be better than all the cards I'm placing in F tier, but I guess you guys can be the judge of that. Now, this might be surprising you guys. The Prince is going to be going inside of S tier. In this current meta, I don't know what it is. I think a big part of it is because of how good the Giant is in this current meta, and also because of the Evolved Lumberjack. A lot of people are playing the Evolved Lumberjack with the Prince. The Rage is also in a really good spot. All these things combined, I think, are really helping the Prince out. Giant Double Prince is in a really good spot. You also have things like Log Bait you can run with the Prince as well, but it's primarily the Giant. My goodness, Giant Prince is in an incredible spot at the moment. But the reason I have the Prince in S tier, not the Giant, is because there's also a lot of people running the Goblin Giant with the Prince too, and just some things he's fitting in that don't always necessarily have the Giant in it. I think the Prince is a bit better than the Giant at the moment, which is why I have him in S tier, and a lot of pros are calling for him to get a nerf. I guess it's very debatable whether it's the meta or if he actually does deserve a nerf. Definitely very debatable, but he's without a doubt S tier, at least in this current meta. He's just getting a lot of value combined with that Evo Lumberjack, which is the best evolution in my opinion. The Balloon is going to be going in A tier. It's always a very consistent win condition because not only is it very good inside of Lava Hound, and Lava Hound, of course, always a very consistent win condition, at least tends to be, it's very good inside of Balloon Cycle. Balloon Cycle is kind of its own thing, where the Balloon is the primary win condition, and there's a lot of people running that in this current meta. You know, Balloon Cycle with the Bomb Tower or even the Evo Cage, and you could even make it work in Lumberloon Freeze. Just a very solid win condition in general. Giant Skeleton's going to be going inside of D tier. It's just hard to make him fit in any deck. I mean, it's kind of an awkward card, pretty expensive, and just not very versatile. So, I don't know. It might need a small buff. It's really hard to make it work. The Lightning, guys, is going to be going in S tier. This big spell is so good in this current meta. It just synergizes so well, especially with Beatdown, and this is a Beatdown meta, so it's probably no surprise why it's so good. It pairs so well with the Prince and the Giant. There's a lot of people running Giant, Prince, Lightning. It's also very good with the Goblin Giant. It's very good with the P.E.K.K.A. It's good with the Golem. It's good with the Electro Giant. And all these things you're seeing a lot of in this current meta. And the Lightning is, I think, what's keeping a lot of these buildings being very average. Whereas a lot of these buildings that I've ranked or I'm going to rank are typically higher than they are. I think the Lightning is what's preventing them from being better. Just because of how much Lightning there is, which just annihilate buildings, as you guys know. And it's probably part of the reason why the Expo is in a pretty rough spot at the moment, which is going in D tier because we're in a beatdown meta. There's also a lot of people running the Lightning, which of course is going to be very valuable against the Expo as well. So the Expo is having a rough time locking on towers, and that's why it's one of the worst win conditions in the game currently. The P.E.K.K.A. is going to be going in D tier as well. It's in a very bad spot ever since she got that range nerf. That has definitely impacted the card a ton because it just makes it much more manageable to defend and changes a lot of interactions. So now pretty much everyone running the P.E.K.K.A. is running the Evolve version. The standard version is nearly impossible to play, which is why I think the regular P.E.K.K.A. is just so low. And as a result of the P.E.K.K.A. being a lot worse, it has helped to revive Golem a tiny bit. Not as much as you would expect, but the Golem is in C tier. And that's why the Elixir Collector has had a tiny bit of usage as well, because it pairs well with the Golem. But again, even though the Golem's a bit better, things like the Electro Giant and the Giant just so much more valuable than the Golem, which is why even though the P.E.K.K.A. is worse, the Golem is still a below average win condition in my opinion. The Royal Giant's also going to be going in C tier because even though the P.E.K.K.A. is worse, I feel like hardly anyone runs the regular Royal Giant. Pretty much everyone running the RG is using the Evolve version, so the regular one I just can't really rank too high because it's just a lot easier to deal with. I mean, there's more opportunities and ways you can defend it, because when you don't have to worry about that Evolve version, I mean, literally, when you're playing things like Skeletons or even Goblins on the regular RG, it's dealing so much damage to it unless you play a response to take it out. The Three Musketeers are going to be going in F tier. Even though the Musketeer got a buff, and that has helped the Musketeer quite a bit, it hasn't really helped the Three Musketeers quite a lot. And even though the Elixir Collector is a little bit better, and sure, there might be like one person that makes the Three Musketeers work at the top of ladder, I don't really think that justifies them being played higher. They're still so easy to deal with, and I think the majority of people are happy when they're playing against the Three Musketeers, just because we know how weak they are. The Dark Prince is going to be going in B tier. Ever since he got that buff, where I believe he takes less time to charge now, that has definitely helped him out a little bit make him not quite as good as the Prince, but definitely more valuable, and definitely people are seeing his value with the splash he does. And Giant Double Prince, he definitely can work very good in that, or with the Sparky. The Poison is going to be going in B tier. It's definitely not as strong as the Fireball in this current meta. Big difference between the two spells, but the Poison primarily going to be used inside a Graveyard. That is where it really shines, but outside of Graveyard, not used nearly as much as the Fireball, which is why I only have it in B tier. But of course, when you are running Graveyard, specifically Splash Yard, you are going to want to be using it. The Princess is going to be going in B tier ever since she got that nerf in the last set of balance changes where it's easier to react to her when she's played at the bridge. That has definitely been a small nerf to her, and she's a bit worse, but with that being said, she's still absolutely incredible inside of log bait, where she's almost always seen, and she can still be used as a win condition, even though you're more likely going to be able to react to her. The Ice Wizard's going to be going in A tier. Now that he has that spawn in effect and just additional splash damage, that has really helped him shine. He's even used sometimes in decks that don't even have the Tornado in it. That really goes to show how much better he is, but especially with the Tornado inside of Splash Yard, Ice Bow, Mortar, even Golem and heavier things, he is just absolutely incredible. The Fire Spirit's going to be going in C tier. This might be a little surprising because the Fire Spirit did get a buff. It actually hasn't really helped it out as much as you'd expect. I think a big part of it is because of the Cannoneer and the Dagger Duchess, that in a lot of matchups, it doesn't even end up reaching the tower anyway, so the buff is kind of practically useless, and it's kind of the same reason why the Furnace is actually going in F tier, because I mean, the Fire Spirit buff doesn't really help the Furnace out a ton. I was kind of hoping it would because of how awful the card is, and it would at least make it viable in at least a deck or two, but it just kind of didn't really help it out much, which might be kind of disappointing, but it's more so the building itself. It's kind of the same as the God Putt and the Barb Putt. It's just too vulnerable to spells. The guards are going to be going in S tier. They're just absolutely incredible. Pretty much at the moment, a lot of decks, it's like they either have the skeletons in them, the guards, or the Goblin Gang. I mean, the guards, especially inside of heavier decks, they really shine. Lava Hound, whew, a lot of Lava players running the guards nowadays as their defensive card of choice. They're also going to be very good inside of things like Mortar. I've seen a lot of people run them with the Giant. You could even make them work inside of Log Bait if you want, Goblin Drill, a lot of different decks you can use the guards in. Myers going to be going S tier. One of the biggest reasons is just simply his versatility. You can run him in a lot of different kinds of decks. Of course, you can run him in a faster cycle deck if you want. Maybe you want to run him in some kind of minor poison deck. You can run minor Mortar, minor Loon cycle, a lot of cycle decks, and then you get to some of the heavier decks. Of course, you can run him inside of Giant. A lot of people might want to run him inside of Giant Double Prince. Some Giant Double Prince players don't have the minors, some do, so it really depends. It comes down to preference. Some Lava players like to use the minor as well, and then some off-meta decks you can use him, or just always he's going to be a trustworthy and handy secondary win condition that you can make him work in. So the Sparky is going to be going in D tier. Just tons of resets to the Sparky. Just very difficult to get it to connect to the tower in a lot of scenarios, especially with all the lightning in this current meta. And then, of course, Rocket, even though it's not as prevalent, just a direct counter to it, of course. The Lava Hound going to be going in B tier. I just think in this current meta, it's not as OP as it often is. It's a very consistent win condition, but I think compared to the Balloon, it's definitely a tier lower, which is why I have it in B tier. I think actually a big factor is because of the recent nerf the Lava Hound got. I believe it had its damage nerf, or was it actually the Lava Pups that got their damage nerfed, and then the Lava Hound was the same? But either way, it got a damage nerf of some sort, which definitely did impact the card a bit, and it's why I don't think it's an A tier, at least in this current meta. The Ice Spirit, guys, believe it or not, is actually going in A tier. That might be surprising to you guys. I think a big reason why is a lot of people are running the Evolved Ice Spirit, so the regular one people aren't using as much. And also, this might be surprising to a lot of you guys. There's more people that are running the Heal Spirit in this specific meta than usual, so that kind of impacts the Ice Spirit as well, and the amount of people running it. But of course, the Ice Spirit going to be very good in a lot of different cycle decks, whether that's with the Expo or the Hog Rider, the Royal Hogs. But again, it's mostly the Evil Ice Spirit that's stronger, and I don't even think it's the regular Ice Spirit that's super OP anymore, which is kind of surprising to think. Definitely something that's changed. Part of it might be because of the Dagger Duchess as well. The Bowler is going to be going in A tier. In this current meta, he's absolutely incredible. almost always, no matter what the meta is, he's at least an average card. But then some metas like this one, he's just even better. A big part of it is because the Royal recruits, people have been very annoyed with the recruits recently, and the Bowler, of course, going to be a very good counter to them. So he's going to be great inside of things like Graveyard Freeze or just Graveyard in general. But then, of course, with the Giant Bowler is a very, very solid combination. Giant Bowler Graveyard, and also the Goblin Giant Bowler can be a very nice combination as well. He's got a lot of health. I feel like he's not super OP, but I would definitely say he's A tier in this current meta. The Log guys, believe it or not, unlike the Arrows, is going to remain in S tier. Even though the Arrows got a radius nerf and they dropped down to A tier, the Log doesn't have the same faith, because the Log got a nerf to the amount of damage it deals to towers, and that's not the reason why people use the Log. The reason why people use the Log is for all the other effects. Of course, the chip damage is nice, but a big part of why people use it is for the 2 elixir counter you get to all the baity cards in the game. Also, that knockback ability you get is also just so solid, as well as the versatility and just the synergy it has in just pretty much every single cycle deck in the game, whether it's Expo, Hog Rider, Royal Hogs, Goblin Drill, Mortar, or more expensive things like with the Royal Giant or even the Giant. You can make it work, of course. Just it fits well in so many different things. It's just an incredible card, and it seems like no matter how many nerfs it gets, it's just always immune. At least it seems that way. It's pretty ridiculous. The Lumberjack is going to be going in C tier. The Evo Lumberjack is what's really broken. It's only a 1-cycle Evo, so people kind of deal with the fact that you have to play kind of a mid card to get to the Evo. The regular Lumberjack, really hardly anyone's playing. It's mostly the Evo 1, that's why it's being used, but I suppose you could run the regular one if you really wanted to in a Golem deck or Lumberloon Freeze, but almost always that's going to have the Evo version, so I can't really rank it super high. The Ice Golem is going to be going in C tier. It's alright inside of Loon Cycle and 2.6, but those decks aren't super meta, so it's not going to be super high. I feel like C tier is pretty justified, but it can get some value in some scenarios. The Mega Minion, guys, is going in A tier. This might be a bit of a shocker. In this current meta, it's so good. A big part of it is because the Giant is meta, and Giant pairs so well with the Mega Minion. The Mega Minion goes well with the Giant as well as the Prince. It's just a very good combination. There's so many people using the Mega Minion with the Giant currently. It's also very good with the Lava Hound as well. Some people prefer running the Mega Minion over things like the Phoenix, especially inside of Lava Hound, and then of course over the minions too, which I mentioned. There's a lot of air cards that people use more, and the Mega Minion is definitely one of them. It's just a very valuable 3 elixir tank, and with the Giant being strong, it's even better than it typically is. The Inferno Drag, though, still going to be going in A tier, because Lava Hound almost always has the Inferno Dragon in it. That's like almost always the case, because you need a tank killer in the deck, and of course it's a very good tank killer, so it's just great against things like Lava Hound, the Giant, you know, a bunch of the beatdown cards in this current meta. Just nice to have in your deck as a support card, which is why you also can use it inside of things like Graveyard Freeze and Lumberloon Freeze, so it's not only restricted to the Lava. The Graveyard is going to be going in A tier as well, and a big part of it is because of Giant Graveyard, because Splash Yard isn't actually all that OP currently. There's more people running Giant Graveyard than Splash Yard. I guess that's the point I'm making, but because both of those decks are still relatively strong, and you see some off-meta Graveyard Freeze decks here and there too, definitely an A tier win condition at the moment. The E-Barbs are going to be going in D tier. They're just, you know, top of ladder, no one's really running them, more competitive. Mostly just going to be a mid-ladder menace card, which is why I think they're D tier. If you know what you're doing, they're going to be pretty easy to defend, that's for sure. The Tornado is going to be going in S tier. In this current meta, it's absolutely incredible. This alternates between S and A tier, but this meta, it is absolutely S tier, without a doubt. So many people running the Tornado. I don't know why, but especially inside a Graveyard, of course, you see it Splash Yard, you see it with the Ice Bow, you see it with the Goblin Drill, you see it a lot of times now. People are running it with the Magic Archer too, the Evo Bomber. E-Giant has kind of made a comeback, which of course goes great with the Tornado. Golem is in a better spot than it was, which of course has the Tornado in it. So because this is a beatdown meta, it's kind of expected that the Tornado is going to be in a great spot. But it's not just beatdown decks that use it. It's cycle decks with the Magic Archer very commonly you see the Tornado in that as well, just for all the king activations and interactions that are very good with it, is why I think it's justified to get S tier for sure in this current meta. The clone is going to be going in F tier. Nothing's really changed. I mean, arrows, tornado, poison, pretty much everywhere. I mean, that kind of explains that. It's not really going to fit well in any deck. So it's just, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. It always seems to be bad no matter what the meta is. Nothing really changes. The Ewiz is going to be going in C tier. Might be kind of surprising because of that buff it got. It's now able to one-shot spirits. Hasn't really helped it as much as you expect. With all the giant we're seeing in this current meta, a lot of people prefer to run other support cards over the Ewiz. So it's still not commonly seen, but at least it's not D tier anymore. Maybe you want to run it inside a P.E.K.K.A. Bridge Spam, or you maybe want to run it in your giant deck instead of the Mega Minion. But you're just going to be better off running other support cards, which is why I consider it a C tier card at the moment. The Goblin Gang is going to be going in S tier. Absolutely incredible, especially inside of bait decks is where it really shines. All different kinds of bait decks. In fact, most bait decks have the Goblin Gang, no matter if they're running bait with the Cannon, the Inferno, the Tesla, the Bomb Tower, whatever the variation, it almost always has a Goblin Gang. If it doesn't, then maybe it'll have guards, but people prefer the Goblin Gang because it baits out those spells. You can also run it with the Prince, where it gets very good value, especially with the Gob Giant. Gob Giant bait with the Prince is absolutely incredible. It's very good with the Recruits as well. That's where it's commonly seen to bait out spells, because people have to worry about the Recruit Shield, the Goblin Gang too, and then all the other bait cards. It's just absolutely obnoxious, and it's in an amazing spot in this current meta. The Dark Goblin is actually only going in B tier. As annoying as it is, ever since it got that damage nerf a couple balance changes ago, it has been way more manageable to deal with. There's just been way less people running the Dark Goblin. There's a lot of bait decks that don't even run the Dark Goblin, and also there's hardly anyone running Mortar Dark Goblin too. So it's definitely not A tier anymore, and it's just much easier to deal with. Battle Ram is going to be going in C tier. I feel like it's pretty manageable if you know what you're doing. Of course, buildings are going to stop it very easily, a lot of stuns, but it's going to be okay inside of P.E.K.K.A, I suppose, but the majority of people running it are going to be running the Evolved version, and I actually changed my mind. I'm putting it in D tier. I kind of talked myself out of it. It is going in D tier. The Executioner is going to be going in D tier as well. I just feel like it's not that great in this current meta. There's just not a whole lot of people running it with the Goblin Drill. Pretty much the only deck you see the Executioner with is going to be Hog X NATO. And because that's about it, I can't really put it much higher than that. It's just pretty niche currently. The Bats are going to be going in C tier. There's not a lot of people that run the regular Bats. Majority of people playing the Bats have the Evolved version, so they're just cycling the regular ones to eventually get to the Evolved one. But if you really want to, I guess you could run them inside of something like Mega Knight Bait or Mortar, but those are typically things that are going to have the Evo Bats. And guys, the Heal Spirit is going to be going in B tier. This is one that might be surprising to a lot of people because it's usually way lower. It's because of the Prince and the Evo Lumberjack being as strong as they are. The Heal Spirit synergizes so well with those decks that there's a lot of people running the Heal Spirit in their giant deck for some reason, or with the Evo Lumberjack in the Prince, because that one elixir healing up that card that's very OP can often be very valuable. So maybe it makes sense that that's the reason why it is, but typically it is much lower without a doubt. The Bandit is going to be going in B tier. Typically it's A tier, but because the P.E.K.K.A is in a very rough spot after she has gotten her nerf, the Bandit likewise is going to drop a little bit as well. Of course, she can be very annoying in other kinds of bridge spam decks, like even if you're not running the Bandit with the P.E.K.K.A or the Evolved P.E.K.K.A. Of course, there's things like the Ram Rider, the Evo Lumberjack that you can still make the Bandit work in, or the Mega Knight. So you have some options, and she's still going to be a pretty solid card for pressuring, of course. The Night Witch is going to be going in C tier. There's some people running her with the Giant, and because the Golem has made a tiny bit of a return too, that has kind of helped revive her a little bit, but by no means is she that good. Definitely there's better support card options than her, which is why she's only going in C tier. The Skeleton Barrel is going to be going in C tier as well. It's pretty much only going to be good in that Recruit Skeleton Barrel deck. You don't really see it with the Mortar anymore, so it's mostly viable only in one thing, and it's not too difficult to defend, especially if you have at least one or two small spells in your deck. The Flying Machine is going to be going in C tier as well. Pretty much no one's running it in Lava Hound anymore. The main deck you're seeing it in is with the Recruits and the Royal Hogs, but don't get me wrong, when paired with those things, it can be absolutely annoying for some players to deal with. And the Fireball, of course, which is very good, going to be a great counter to it, and that's very good in this meta. Cannon Cart is going to be going in B tier. Ever since it got that nerf, definitely helped kind of keep it in check a little bit. Way more manageable to deal with it. There's also less people running the Mortar, and the Mortar was the main deck you saw the Cannon Cart in, so you're seeing less of that. Maybe you see it here and there in a Bridge Spam deck, but overall, definitely more of an average card now after it ended up getting that nerf. The Mega Knight is going to be going in C tier, even though the P.E.K.K.A. is worse now. The regular Mega Knight is not really all that. Majority of people running the Mega Knight have to run the Evolved version. With that being said, though, the Prince pairs very well with the Mega Knight. So there actually are some people running Mega Knight, Prince, Archer Queen, Wall Breakers. That's probably the best Mega Knight deck in the game currently, but the Mega Knight doesn't get quite nearly as much value as the Giant does in a lot of circumstances. The Zappies are going to be going in D tier. They have just been, they're going in F tier. They have been absolutely trash for such a long time. There might be like one person that runs the Zappies with the Recruits, but even inside of Recruits, they're just not that good. They're just pretty bad. You're better off running other support cards. You just don't really need to have the Zappies. They're just so weak to spells, and they just don't really do anything. If I'm being honest, they just really don't do anything in most scenarios. The Bar Barrel is going to be going in A tier. Absolutely incredible inside of beatdown decks. It's basically the Log of beatdown decks. That's the way you can think of it, because Log is in all the cycle decks or medium cost decks like Royal Giant. Bar Barrel, always going to be seen in the heavier decks. I don't think it's as versatile, though, as the Log is or as valuable. But with that being said, going to be absolutely incredible inside of things like Graveyard, with the Golem, with the Electro Giant, things along those lines. And it always is a very, very solid small spell, no matter what the meta is, especially if you're a beatdown or a control player. The Hunter is going to be going in C tier. Even though it got that buff not too long ago, it hasn't helped the card out much. I believe it was a health buff. He's still pretty bad, and most Royal Giant players prefer to run the Phoenix. Now, here's the thing. The Evo Hunter is what's better. A lot of the people running the Hunter, they run the Evolved version. It's not the regular version. So the Evo Hunter, way, way better. Regular Hunter, though, definitely C tier. I just wanted to really emphasize that. So the Royal Ghost is going to be going in A tier, definitely better than the Bandit. One of the main reasons why, even though the Ghost and the Bandit are often seen in similar Bridge Spam decks, they pair well together, the Ghost is seen very frequently inside of Royal Giant. And there's a lot of people using, especially the Evolved Royal Giant, which the Ghost pairs very well in, which is what I believe gives it the edge over the Bandit and why I have it in A tier. It's just very nice to have that invisibility factor as well, and you're just getting that splash damage. It's just a very, very valuable card. Magic Archer going to be going in B tier. I definitely think it's in a decent spot in this current meta, especially paired with the Wall Breakers and the Miner. It's basically a win condition, not really used inside of P.E.K.K.A. or Bridge Spam decks as much anymore, which is why it's not any higher, but with the Wall Breakers especially, it is a menace when paired with the Tornado. It can be really obnoxious to deal with sometimes, especially if you don't have a good spell to take it out. The Rascals are going to be going in D tier. They just always seem to be bad no matter what the meta is. I just don't think they're F, though, because there's some matchups where they can be absurdly good and underrated, and they can be annoying if you don't have arrows or log, but because arrows and log are very prevalent, as well as Fireball, they're definitely pretty weak most of the time, but you can make them work, I suppose, in some Prince Bait deck. The Snowball is going to be going in B tier. I would even say the regular Snowball is just as good as the Evolved Snowball in a lot of scenarios. Inside of Loon Cycle, it's very, very solid in Giant Graveyard, which is why it's actually a decent small spell currently. Definitely higher than I would typically rank it, because in the current meta with Giant Graveyard, Evo Snowball sometimes doesn't even get played, but the regular Snowball people want to use, which is very interesting. The Recruits are going in D tier. When people talk about how annoying the Recruits are, they're referring to the Evolved Recruits. The standard ones honestly really suck. Like, they're actually pretty bad. Most of the time, they're not reaching the tower as long as your cycle's good and you know what they're doing. People play them to get to the evolved version. That's just something I want to make very clear. The regular one's not very good, and that's the case for a lot of the Evos. Royal Hogs are going to be going in A tier. They're for sure one of the best win conditions in the game, especially in that Royal Hog cycle deck. They're just absolutely phenomenal. But then not only that, with the Evo recruits, of course, they're going to be very, very good as well. In those two decks, they really dominate, and that's why I think they're an A tier win condition, because they've just been a solid card for a while now. The Gob Giant, the regular one, is going to be going in C tier. It's just kind of the same thing as the regular recruits. The regular Gob Giant, it's just so much easier to deal with. It really is, because you don't have to worry about the goblin spawning, which is why hardly anyone runs the regular Gob Giant. It's not that good without the Evo. And it's really the same case with the E-Drag as well. No one is running this thing if they don't have the Evo. Just no one is, especially the Lightning in this meta, which absolutely slams it. That's another reason why no one would be running it. Everyone has the Evolved version. They play it to get to the Evo version. That's the idea behind it, but on their own, they're really not all that, which is why the only reason why people use them in the first place, their Evo, is because they're a one-cycle Evo, so they only have to play the trash version only once. The Ramrider is going to be going in B tier. After they've nerfed the Ramrider a couple times, that's successfully reduced the usage of the card drastically, which is why, for the most part, you're only seeing this card from time to time with the P.E.K.K.A. and the Mega Knight. It's not as versatile as it was, where you could just run it in so many different things. It was insane how many different Ramrider decks there were, or you could even get by with just having the Ramrider as your win condition. You didn't even have to have the Mega Knight or the P.E.K.K.A. in your deck, or something like a Monk, but it's definitely way more balanced now. The Wall Breakers are going to be going inside of B tier as well. The Evolved Wall Breaker is definitely better than the regular Wall Breakers, but this is one where it's interesting because there's a lot of people that prefer running the regular ones over the Evolved, but most of the time people have the Evolved version. The regular ones, though, can be very good, especially with the Miner as well as the Magic Archer. The Earthquake, guys, is actually going to be going in A tier. This is one that I feel like it really depends on the meta. Sometimes it's B, but in this current meta, a lot of people are running Royal Hog Cycle, but there's also a lot of people running Hog Cycle, of course, with the Earthquake as well. That Gobstein variant with the Firecracker, of course, that is pretty solid. And the Earthquake is just going to be a great way of breaking through buildings, getting towards the tower. Even though buildings aren't as prevalent in this current meta, a lot of people use it for that tower chip damage. That is another reason why people play it, especially at the end of the match. You can just cycle Earthquake so quickly and get a lot of damage. It really piles up. The Cage is going to be going in D tier. The regular Cage, just no one's playing it. Everyone running it runs the Evolved version with the recruits, with the Graveyard, whatever you're running it in. No one just has the regular Cage. It's always that Evolved version, which eventually comes down. The Fisherman's going to be going in A tier. After the nerf it ended up getting, where it doesn't slow down cards as much, definitely slightly less people running it. And now it's kind of returned to being played mostly with the Royal Giant. Before, it was getting way too versatile before that nerf. It was being played in a ton of other things. Now it's mostly just the Royal Giant again. Maybe you see it with some Gob Giant and P.E.K.K.A. here and there, but that's definitely something that has changed a bit, which is why I think it is in A tier. Elixir Golem is going to be going in D tier. It's just in a rough spot in this current meta. Typically in most metas, it's in a pretty bad spot. The Elixir Collector is not all that. There's a lot of good counters to the Elixir Golem. It's just, in the Evo Wizard, something that commonly pairs well with it is one of the worst Evos as well. So E-Golem doesn't have a lot going on for it, especially because the healer's in an awful spot as well. I would say the healer's even worse than the Elixir Golem, because a lot of the E-Golem decks don't even have the healer in it. So it's just it just makes sense in a way. The healer's definitely one of the worst cards in the game. Firecracker's going to be going in C tier, because even though arrows are a bit worse, there's still not that many people running the Firecracker, because the poison, the fireball, is still very valuable against her. And the other thing you guys really underestimate, I feel like, is the King Tower activations. You can't just put the Firecracker in any deck and call it a day, especially at the top of ladder and in competitive, because the King Tower activation is so valuable in a lot of matchups, and people are always going to be able to get that King Tower activation easily when they're playing against a Firecracker, which is why you see it in very few decks. The Hog Rider is going to be the main thing you see the Firecracker in, and majority of people running her are running the Evo version anyway and not the regular version. The Royal Delivery is going to be going in B tier. Definitely a very valuable defensive card in some minor decks, and especially Royal Hog Cycle. Going to be great. It's not insanely versatile though. That's the one drawback of it. And you're, of course, limited where you can place it. You can only play it on your side of the map. And in some matchups, it gets little to no value. So it is very matchup dependent, which is why I think it is in B tier. And then the Skeleton Dragons as well going to be going in B tier, which might be a little surprising because typically they are a bit higher, oftentimes A tier. But a lot of players in this meta are running the Mega Minion over the Skeleton Dragons, which is very interesting. And also Mortar Bait isn't in as good of a spot as it normally is, and that was one of the decks that commonly used the Skeleton Dragons in it. So I think that's a big reason as well. The E-Spirit going to be going in A tier. Always a very, very good card no matter what the meta is. I think it's on par with the Ice Spirit currently. Around the same amount of people are using each Spirit in different decks. Of course, the E-Spirit, the main difference between the Ice Spirit, you're commonly going to see it in decks where the King Tower activation doesn't matter. So that's going to be things like Royal Giant and the Expo. The E-Spirit's going to be absolutely phenomenal in those decks because, of course, the win condition, it makes no difference whether the opponent has that King activated or not, and that chain effect going to be great against bait and graveyard, of course. The Electro Giant going to be going in B tier, definitely a bit better than the Golem, but not as good as the Giant. The E-Giant, though, definitely made a comeback. There's a lot of people running the E-Giant with the Bowler at the moment, a really OP combination, as well as the Evo Cannon. Definitely helped revive the E-Giant and make it a viable beatdown deck once again. The Mother Witch is going to be going in C tier, slightly better than it normally is. I've seen some people running it again with the Giant as well as the Goblin Giant. Still, though, not going to be that great, especially with how many people are running the Fireball, and Graveyard isn't super duper OP, making her less of a requirement than maybe she otherwise would be in some metas. Gobble is going to be going in C tier, kind of an average or even below average win condition. A lot of people running a lot of different splash cards in this current meta. Dark Prince is a little better than it normally is. The Royal Ghost is in a really good spot. Tons of people running things like the Guards, the Gob Gang, a lot of different ways it can be countered. And because the Evo version isn't all that anymore, it's kind of made the regular version sizzle out a bit as well. As for the champions, the Golden Knight is going to be going in F tier. In my opinion, it is the worst champion in the game. There's not really any deck it's required in. Maybe you play against the occasional E-Giant Golden Knight player, but again, most E-Giant players prefer running the Bowler or something like a Dark Prince that's getting more value in a lot of scenarios, which is why I think it's an F tier champion and can definitely use a small buff. The Archer Queen, for some reason, got a buff over the Golden Knight. I don't even know how that happened, but the Archer Queen going in A tier, ever since she got that buff where she stays invisible slightly longer, definitely has helped her out a bit, which is why she's so prevalent, especially inside of Royal Hog Cycle, but also with the Mega Knight and the Prince. She's very good in that deck as well. A very, very solid champion. Of course, the Skeleton King is going to be going in C tier. It was very good in that Mortar Bait deck, but that Mortar Bait deck is a bit worse currently, which means the Skeleton King is a tad bit worse as well, but he can be good inside of Graveyard, and also Royal Giant Tombstone Skeleton King. I've seen a couple people running that again, so definitely viable, but not as good as he was. The Mighty Miner is going to be going in B tier. The deck he's commonly seen in, of course, is going to be Recruits. He's absolutely phenomenal in that. Ever since he got that buff where he charges up quicker, he is great with the Recruits, and the Hog Rider as well. I would say he's a decent champion, which is why I put him at B tier. The Phoenix, which I guess comes before the other champions, that is going to be, where is the Phoenix? The Phoenix is going to be going in, I believe, B tier in this current meta, because there's a lot of people running the Mega Minion over the Phoenix. It's a bit strange because usually it's the opposite, but Giant is so good, and a lot of people opt to go for the Mega Minion, which is one of the biggest reasons why. Normally that's not the case, and the Phoenix will be played in Royal Giant a lot more, for example, but also the Evolve Hunter has replaced the Phoenix inside of the Royal Giant, which is very interesting as well. So it's no longer an A tier. In fact, in a lot of metas, it was S tier, but now it goes to B because of those replacements that a lot of people have made inside of the heavier decks. Now, this might shock you guys. The Monk is actually going in A tier. In this current meta, he is so good, especially inside of Royal Giant. With the Royal Giant and the Evolve Hunter, there's a lot of people running the Monk again. And then in some other things as well, some off-meta things, some bridge spam decks with the Evo Lumberjack, the Monk has kind of found his place back in the meta again, which is pretty surprising because he has been bad for such a long time. So seeing him back again is kind of crazy. He's also a pretty good counter to the Prince, which is, I think, another reason why, because when you pop the Monk ability, he absorbs the Prince charge in a way and ends up being a pretty good counter to him, especially if you pair the Monk with something like the Guards. The Little Prince is going to be going in D tier. He's just so bad after all the nerfs he got. He was so broken, and then he got absolutely killed. So it's kind of interesting how that ended up happening, but that's the case for a lot of cards in the game, including the Void, which it got a small, very small buff in the last set of balance changes. Didn't really seem to help it out much. Tiny bit of people maybe running it inside of Lava Hound, for example, but that's about it. Of course, you're going to be better off running tons of other spells. Goblin Demolisher got a small buff. Didn't help revive it too much. It's still going to be inside of D tier, along with the Goblin Curse. Gob Curse only viable in some niche bait decks, and that's about it. The Gob Machine, on the other hand, is actually a little bit better. After it got that buff, it's been seeing a bit of a return recently. Of course, it was even better with the Rune Giant, but even still, there's some people playing it in some bridge spam decks and off-meta things. It's pretty interesting. It's kind of one of those cards where you play against it and you're like, you don't expect it to be good, but then it ends up winning the person the game in some scenarios. So it's kind of a unique and interesting card, but I wouldn't underestimate it. It can actually be decent, and it's definitely better than the Demolisher and the Curse. The Bush, though, is going in F tier. It's just absolutely horrible. It's just, like, why would you use the Bush? I mean, it's kind of fun, but it's just bad. There's not really any deck that plays it. It's the worst out of all the new Gob cards. The Gobstein is going in A tier, even after the nerfs it received. Still incredible inside of things like Hog Rider, of course. Hog, Gobstein, Firecracker, a very solid deck. It's going to be very good inside of Graveyard as well. You could still run it with the Ram Rider if you want to. It's just going to be a very solid support card and tank that works in a lot of different decks. It's just not as versatile as it used to be and as oppressive. And finally, it takes a little bit of skill to use at least, but it is still a well above average card without a doubt. So it's interesting because we have 3 champions that are all in a really good spot in this current meta. The Rune Giant is going in F tier, as well as the Berserker. They absolutely killed the Rune Giant. They just, ever since they made it from infinite enhance to 5 seconds, that just pretty much killed the card. On top of it getting that hit points nerf. So went from being one of the best cards in the game to one of the worst. Berserker pretty much requires the Rune Giant to be viable. So if the Rune Giant's bad, no surprise that the Berserker is going to suck. So that's kind of the reasoning behind why those two are F tier. Princess Tower is going to be going S tier. It's without a doubt the best tower troop in the game. I know a lot of pro players are always crying about the Dagger Duchess, but the fact of the matter is, over 50% of the people, in fact, I would even say it's 60, 70%, 70% of the top 200 still runs the Princess Tower. Well above 50% of players in the top 200 run the Princess Tower, which means it objectively is S tier. It's just the OG, the standard tower troop. A lot of decks people are running, like using the Princess Tower, whether it's a cycle deck, a control deck, a beatdown deck. A lot of those archetypes, a lot of people prefer the Princess Tower. However, with that being said, a lot of pro players, and maybe some casuals too, do complain about the Dagger Duchess. But one of the biggest reasons why is because it's matchup dependent. So the Dagger Duchess is going to be very good in a few types of matchups or with certain kinds of decks that you want to play very aggressive. So some people might be running the Dagger Duchess with the Giant, for example, the Giant Prince deck that tends to be pretty aggressive and you're not focused on defending as much, or a deck where you want to be really aggressive in single and the Dagger Duchess is better in single, but then worse as the match progresses. the Dagger Duchess is going to be absolutely phenomenal against things like Logbait. So Logbait players especially are going to really hate the Dagger Duchess. And because Logbait's pretty decent in this current meta, that's why a lot of people are, of course, hating on the Dagger Duchess. But the Duchess is going to be a lot worse against beatdown decks. So it's going to be worse against something like a Giant, or a Golem, or a Lava Hound. But it is going to be a lot better against cycly decks, especially baity decks. And because those tend to be strong in the meta, that is why the Dagger Duchess is in A tier. Now, the Cannoneer is going to be going in B tier. The Cannoneer is even worse than the Dagger Duchess. The Dagger Duchess, definitely the second best tower troop. Cannoneer is going to be worse than the Dagger Duchess. The Cannoneer is becoming more niche. After the Dagger Duchess buff, the Cannoneer has kind of been sizzling out quite a lot. You pretty much are only going to be able to use this thing in maybe a mortar deck if you want. There's some people that maybe want to run Giant Graveyard with the Cannoneer instead of the Princess Tower. Maybe you want to run the Cannoneer with some... It's just with some off-meta deck. It's kind of very dependent on preference, and I guess at the end of the day, this is why a lot of people don't like tower troops and why it gets complicated, because it's just very matchup dependent. It's going to be good against beatdown decks, but it's going to be absolutely atrocious against bait. So it's very inconsistent, especially compared to the Princess Tower and even the Dagger Duchess in this current meta. The Chef, though, is going to be going in D tier. The only reason why it's not in F tier is because there's a couple people making it work inside of things like the Goblin Giant or maybe Giant, but it has fallen off a ton, and the small buff it has gotten in the last set of balance changes where it's cooking pancakes a little bit quicker has certainly not helped to revive it, and without a doubt, it is the worst tower troop in the game, no questions asked. And now let's get into the evolutions. Starting off with the worst evolution in the game, we got the Evolved Tesla. Ever since they removed its Death Shockwave, it has been significantly easier to break through. It doesn't get nearly as much value, which is why it's by far the worst building evolution in the game. The second worst evolution in the game is going to be the Evolved Goblin Drill. Ever since they reworked it so it doesn't deal depth damage every time it respawns, it has been drastically worse, and there's not many people that prefer using it over the regular Goblin Drill. The Evolved Snowball, even after the couple of buffs it has received, it still remains to be one of the worst evolutions in the game, because there's still some scenarios where the regular Snowball is going to be a bit better in some situations, so the Evolved Snowball is just not very consistent, and you're going to be much better off using something like the Evolved Zap. The Evolved P.E.K.K.A, guys, is going to be the start of D tier. She has fallen off quite a lot ever since the P.E.K.K.A got that range nerf. It has significantly impacted the Evolved P.E.K.K.A, and it is just used much less. In fact, there's even some people now that prefer using the regular P.E.K.K.A over the Evolved version ever since they reworked it, so the amount of healing it does based on the unit it kills is different. Next is going to be the Evolved Wizard. Ever since the nerf, the shield knockback, and also the shield hit points, he has been toned down a lot, and he's had a hard time finding a place in the meta, but you can definitely use him in some off-meta decks if you want and make him work. Evolved Battle Ram is going to be next. There's a lot of stuns that reset him, like the E-Wiz, for example, or any kind of reset. And if you have a building, of course, it's a lot more manageable to stop him. And if you have something heavy, it's definitely going to be able to stop it from reaching your tower. So I feel like it's overall not too difficult to deal with, but you can use it in bridge spam decks if you want to. Evolved Musketeer is going to be next. They gave her a couple buffs, which has definitely helped her out. But for the most part, you're only going to be able to use her in things like Giant Graveyard and Loon Cycle. And I think overall, if you know what you're doing and you can block her long shots with a unit and protect and predict her, then in some scenarios she gets pretty much no value. This might be surprising, guys, but the Evolved Barbarians are finally not in the bottom two tiers. Maybe it's because they were given out for free for the Valentine's Day event. A lot of people have found decks that they're good in. People have been using them again in things like Bridge Spam, Giant Graveyard, Golem, and more. So they're not as bad as they were before, and people have realized they actually get a little bit of value. Next are going to be the Evolved Archers. You can use them in things like Expo or Giant Graveyard, but arrows are still so prevalent in the meta. Even after the Radius nerf the arrows received, They're being used so much, and overall, the Evolve Archers are pretty underwhelming and easy to deal with if you know what you're doing, especially because they're so low in hit points. And it's kind of the same scenario for the Evolve Firecracker. She's going to be very useful in things like Hog Cycle, but that's kind of going to be about it. And the main drawback of the Firecracker is the King activation, and there's so many decks where you can't afford to be letting your opponent get an easy King activation, which is why, in my opinion, she's always going to be kept in check, even though casuals really hate her. Next is going to be the Evolve Mortar. Since we've had a beatdown meta recently, it's been a lot harder for the Evolve Mortar to lock on the tower, making it significantly worse, and it has just been toned down a lot recently as we've seen a lot of cards that synergize well with the Mortar get nerfed. That has, of course, as expected, bring down the usage of the Evolve Mortar and make it more manageable to deal with. The Evolve Royal Giant's going to be next. I feel like his evolution is very situational. If you're playing against a building or an air deck, it's practically useless, but of course if you're playing against something like a mini P.E.K.K.A. or Barbarians, that knockback is going to be incredibly useful, so it's very matchup dependent, and I think it's overall a well-balanced evolution in that sense. The Evolved Mega Knight, this is kind of surprising, guys, but it's going in C tier. I thought after the Evolved P.E.K.K.A. got pretty much killed after the P.E.K.K.A. nerf, I was thinking the Evolved Mega Knight was going to be a lot better, and people thought that at first too, and last month we definitely saw a big rise in the usage of Mega Knight, but recently in this current meta, there have not been a lot of people running the Mega Knight, and I think it's because of some other evolutions just being significantly stronger than it, and overall, if you know what you're doing, you can defend him without too much of an issue, but it's been interesting to see and definitely unexpected. The Evolved Dark Goblin as well, guys, has really fallen off. It went all the way from S and A tier all the way to C because there have just been way less people using it. A big part of it is because of arrows and log, people realizing they can kill it without too much trouble, but the other big reason is because the Dark Goblin's damage got nerfed. So there's less people using the Dark Goblin in general, and because of course you have to use the regular Dark Goblin to eventually get to the evolved version, with the regular version being worse, that of course is going to really impact the evolved version, which is why there's way less people using it. We're going to start off B tier with the Evolved Bomber. Even though there's way less people using it in cycle decks, now that it doesn't get that additional bounce on top of towers, in beatdown decks especially, it is still more than viable. You will commonly see this card in things like Electro Giant, Golem, Lava Hound, maybe Giant Graveyard, heavier decks, but in cycle, it's pretty much not viable, which is why in cycle decks, you don't see it and why it's no longer S tier. So in my opinion, good change to the Evolved Bomber because it's still viable, but not completely dead. The Evolved Goblin Giant is going to be in B tier as well. Definitely a bit worse ever since they gave it that nerf where it doesn't spawn goblins as frequently now, ever since they made that change, and also with the chef not being absolutely broken anymore, that has helped balance him out as well. And then the Evolved E-Drag is going to be next. This is one where it's kind of like the Royal Giant. It's very situational and depends on the matchup, because when you're against a beatdown deck, this thing is basically S tier. But when you're against a cycle deck, it's basically F tier, which is why it kind of balances out to being an average evolution, and it's so matchup based, which can be kind of annoying sometimes, but it's just how it is. I mean, if you're running a beatdown deck and you don't have a lightning, it's just getting infinite value. But if you're playing against a cycle deck with basically no tanks, it's not really doing anything. So that's kind of just how it is. The Evolved Skeletons, even though there's 3 instead of 4, they have still proven to be very valuable, especially in cycle decks. You're just not going to be able to run them in every deck in the game anymore, which is probably how it should be. So was a very good change to them, making them kind of a more balanced evolution. Still going to be very good inside of things like Hog, for example, Royal Hogs, and even in some heavier things from time to time, like the Royal Giant. Now, this is a tiny bit of a prediction, but in my opinion, the Evolved Hunter is going to be next. I don't think it's a broken evolution, but I also don't think it's going to be bad either. It seems to be pretty balanced, especially because it's a 2-cycle evolution. In some matchups, it's not going to get as much value, of course, especially when you're against cycle decks, but if you're against a heavier deck, say Lava Hound, for example, oh my goodness, it can pretty much take out a whole Lava Loon push on his own. Absolutely insane. And then that would also apply to things, of course, like Electro Giant, Golem, anything super heavy. Royal Giant, it's going to be outstanding against, but then cycle decks, it's not going to be as good, or bait. So it really just depends. The Evolved Royal Recruits are going to be next. This is a controversial one because I know so many people hate the recruits and think they're absolutely broken. But in my opinion, it's not just the recruits that are strong, it's the things that are used with the recruits. For example, things like the Evolved Wall Breakers, the Evolved Goblin Cage, which I personally think are a little better than the Evo recruits, which helps them be good. And after the change they got, where it takes them a little bit longer to charge, that has definitely helped balance them out a tiny bit. And I don't think they're as broken as people think they are. It's just the cards that synergize well with them. For example, the Evolved Goblin Cage is a big reason behind that. Commonly with the recruits, you're always seeing the Evolved Goblin Cage. It's such good synergy because it just is unbreakable defense in a lot of scenarios. And the Evo Cage is also used in other things as well, like Electro Giant, Lava Hound, Splash Yard. So it's a very versatile evolution. The main drawback of it is it's useless against air decks. When you're playing against a Lava Hound deck or Loon Cycle, it's pretty much doing absolutely nothing compared to what the regular cage would do. And that's one of the only reasons why it's not absolutely broken. We're going to start off A tier with the Evolve Goblin Barrel. This thing is absolutely incredible in so many different things. Of course, it's going to be good in OG bait decks where you're kind of used to running a bait deck with the Inferno or the Cannon or the Tesla, your building of choice, but then it can also be very good with the Evo Royal Recruits, which people have started synergizing with it. And that's a really disgusting combination, which is why I think a lot of people hate the recruits at the moment. A big part of it is because of this, but because it shows you where the fake barrel is now and the real one, I think that's what prevents it from being S tier and why it's not as broken anymore. But the Evo barrel is still so good because you still have to defend 2 Goblin Barrels at the end of the day, especially if both lanes are getting tanked for. You cannot ignore that fake one, which is why it's very strong. And next we have the Evolve Wall Breakers. These things are very, very strong as well, especially ever since they increased the amount of death damage they do. These things for 2 elixir just blow up everything. It is absolutely ridiculous. I think the only reason why they're not S tier is because of things like the Cannoneer as well as the Dagger Duchess Tower Troops, which kind of help keep them in check a tiny bit because, of course, those are going to be better against them than the Princess Tower is. And also you have other buildings that are really broken right now, like the Evo Cannon. But I think if it wasn't for stuff like that, they would definitely be S tier. The bats, in my opinion, always an underrated evolution. A lot of casual players don't think they're very good, but I think the reason they're so solid is because of their versatility. You can use them in so many different things. You can use them with things like the Evo Wall Breakers, for example, inside of a Mega Knight deck. You could use them in Mortar. You could run them in baity decks with the Miner. You can run them just in swarmy type decks and E-Golem, toxic things like that. Bridge spam, you can really just make them work in a lot of different things. I mean, they tend to pair well in a lot of off-meta decks or just synergize well with other evolutions, and I think that's really the appeal behind them and why they're just always an above-average evolution no matter what the meta is. The Evolved Valkyrie is going to be next. She's especially very good inside of Lava Hound decks. That's where she really, really shines. You can, of course, use her in some other things like Hog X NATO and maybe... what else? Graveyard, potentially. But Lava is where she's really known to be very good because you can just build a big Lava push and then defend everything if they go in the other lane with an Evo Valk. It can just defend any win condition. It's just absolutely incredible. But in my opinion, guys, the Evolved Knight is actually a bit better than the Evolved Valkyrie at the moment, which might be surprising you guys because this hasn't been the case for a while now, but the Knight has been making a return, especially in some things like log bait decks. A lot of bait players prefer using the Knight, which is 1 elixir less for that shield effect and tanking for a long time. People are really liking that. Also in Graveyard, many people are using the Knight again as well. And then you can also use him in other things like with the Hog Rider, for example, and Expo. So I just think he's a bit more versatile than the Valkyrie currently, and there's just a little bit more people using him. But that's something that seems to change depending on the meta in the month. Next is going to be the Evolve Ice Spirit. This is probably surprising to a lot of people because now that it only slows things down for 2 times instead of 3, people thought that was going to kill it, but I guess because it does an additional amount of damage, that helped kind of compensate for that nerf a bit, and it is still one of the very best evolutions in the game. You commonly see it so much inside of cycle decks, whether it's Royal Hog Cycle, maybe you're running a Expo deck as well. It could be a Goblin Drill deck. It could be, for example, a Mortar deck. It is just so solid in Cycle especially. And then even in some other things like Bridge Spam, and it just allows your defense to be really solid, holding things in place for such a long time. Now, guys, we get to S tier. The Evo Zap guys, kind of like the Evo Ice Spirit, it's surprising how good it is still, even after the nerf it got, where it only zaps things 2 times instead of 3. The reason why is because in beatdown decks, it's essentially a requirement. Pretty much most of the beatdown decks you see nowadays run the Evolve Zap, and it's simply because the Evolve Snowball is just so bad still, even after the buffs it got. So beatdown decks don't really have a choice other than running the Evolve Zap, which is why you're always seeing it with things like the Goblin Giant, the Lava Hound. What else? I mean, Giant Graveyard, you commonly see it as well. Giant Prince decks or the Evo Lumberjack decks often use the Evo Zap. P.E.K.K.A as well, even though there's less people running P.E.K.K.A now after the nerf, so many people are using it, where you're almost always seeing the Evo Zap. And then, guys, the Evo Cannon, even after the Cannon nerf, where the Cannon now they were originally going to nerf the damage of the cannon, but they opted to go for the fire rate nerf of the cannon instead. Even though that has been the case, it has not impacted the evolved cannon very much because its evolution is just so broken. It's so defensive. I mean, you're literally getting 9 bombs dropping from the sky, exploding, and in double and triple elixir, you can just imagine how much value that is in so many scenarios. It's just absolutely absurd. I mean, especially if you're playing against bait decks or swarm things, but even if you're against beatdown decks, I mean, let's say a Golem Night Witch is coming down. You literally play it, and then it's hitting the Golem and the Night Witch, killing like all the bats, and there might be a baby dragon there as well. So it really kind of makes your opponent struggle because they don't want to clump everything together when they know you have your Evo Cannon in cycle, but sometimes it's like, what choice do they have? So you can see why it's just so valuable, and in a lot of the cycle decks now, so many of them are using the Evo Cannon, especially Logbait, Hog Rider, Royal Hogs, Goblin Drill, but then even in some heavier things like Graveyard as well, which is why it's just so good. And then lastly, guys, we got the Evolved Lumberjack, which of course is going at the top of S tier, even though it got that nerf where you can't stack it anymore, where you can go in for another rage spell to essentially make the Evo Lumberjack just be alive infinitely. It has still proven to be the best evolution in the game by far. He's just incredibly versatile. You just can fit him in so many different decks, and he has definitely revived beatdown. It's why I think we have a really big beatdown in bridge spam meta right now. It's definitely because of this guy. I mean, it's absolutely incredible inside of things like Golem, inside of things like Giant, inside of Goblin Giant, with the Battle Ram, with the Ram Rider, and it is just so annoying for people to deal with. And yeah, when he runs out of the rage, of course, then he kind of expires and dies really quick. But this is why he's so valuable on defense too, because when you're defending a push, and the units you know are going to be staying in the radius of the rage when he dies, he's just going to stay there defending everything. So he's not only good on offense, I would say, if anything, the nerf has kind of made him worse on offense, but he's still just as good on defense. So there's just so many different ways you can use him throughout the match. It's not even only on offense, it's defense too. But then offensively, once you have other things paired with the Evo Lumberjack, say you're sending it in with a Royal Giant, for example, or a Giant, you know they have to defend the Giant or the thing near it, so that means they're inevitably going to have to play things in the Rage spell, which means it's not that difficult to make sure it's staying inside of the Rage in a lot of circumstances. So hopefully that makes sense of explaining why he's still very broken and likely still needs another nerf. If you guys enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe if you guys are not subscribed already. You can use creator code BOSS to support me in any Supercell game. Let me know if you guys prefer how I recorded this evolution tier list this time around, where I literally didn't edit at all. Oftentimes, when I'm naming each card, I'll have a edit or a cut in between instead of just talking basically the whole time like this without edits. Do you guys prefer raw footage like this, or do you think my explanations are better when I have editing, a little bit of editing, and take kind of a break in between each one? Let me know which style you guys prefer, and thanks again until next time, guys.